Okay, let's go ahead and begin. There's not too many of us this week, but I'm expecting a few more to be joining us in a few minutes. Let me kind of lay the groundwork here because this topic really gets into a number of issues that come together when we think about continuous change. And when there is continuous change, the number of changes that may be happening simultaneously, possibly non-aligned across an organization. Going back to one of my earlier posts, this goes back to a conversation I had with a coworker maybe 20, 25 years ago, where we sat down talking about change fatigue within the organization. And very quickly, between the two of us, we were able to identify 30 different change initiatives that were at the division or corporate level in the past 5 years. And we kind of shocked ourselves because we never really thought about it. They were just happening all over. But those are the ones that we knew about. It probably overlooked the number that were at the department level and definitely overlooked the number that were at the individual developmental level. That was 30. And these were all done ad hoc, all for good reasons, though. And it occurred to me in thinking about this is that even that far back, we were really not looking at individual change initiatives, but really a continuous mess of change. That's kind of what we're going to try to talk about today is how do we get a handle over what that mess is? What do we call it? And what does it really mean to our traditional ways of looking at organizational change? So going forward, then, we generally think about change as being incremental, small things, or the big transformational changes. And this leads into a number of questions that I would like to pose for others in a number of different ways. For example, if there's always pressure for change, to the extent that we do incremental changes, are we relieving those pressures and moving forward? Or do we wait for those pressures to basically reach a breaking point and we become reactive then, being forced to do a very large change as what might be thought of as a catch-up? This then gets into the question of, do you end up at the same place with incremental changes versus the transformative changes? And I can answer that possibly both ways, but let me open it to others for your comments.
I've had similar experiences with what you've had, but it wasn't as much about this is a change initiative. This is going to be just a pilot, but it's a pilot that never ends. They start really well, small group together, and they just seem to carry on forever. And one of the things about it is that typically these things are funded by operating budgets. So there is no sort of a special fund. So when the money runs out, the project has to come to an end. These are just maybe funded by some division manager. He just says, "I will just keep on, kicking the tires, look a bit more," and they never seem to come to an end. It's almost like how we're really good at starting wars, but we don't know how to end the war. Just get that
Okay.
feeling, yeah, and you just get accumulation of these things, as you say. But unless there's something like a PMO, project management office, or something like a program management office, nobody has a clue at who's doing what. But you're right. You go down to the cafeteria, you find out that, oh, how many projects are you working on, or how many pilots are you working on? And you add them up there, and it's right. It's around 30 or something.
Right. In which case, they're getting things started because they see the need, but they're really not organized as to how to do a follow through or prioritize efforts, and they then become subject to the budget and time availability without really doing as a set aside and focus.
Yeah, and sometimes the sponsor loses his or her attention, and they move on to something else.
Yeah.
But but that message doesn't get passed on. So that project or pilot team, they just keep on working because
Right.
maybe they find it interesting, or And one of the funny things I read was about, how we do the forming, norming sort of thing, the
Right.
forming thing. Some teams develop such a great bond, they don't want to break up. So they just keep on carrying on.
Okay, in which the case they're really stuck at getting started.
Or they don't want to shut it down and break the bonds. So they just keep on going, carrying on.
Yeah, when you talk about shutting down, there was one change initiative that I saw that had failure written all over it at the very beginning. It was just a poorly designed change objective, but it was initiated by the president of the company, and he staffed it and budgeted it.
Mm.
And it would led into a lot of busy work. But when you looked at the busy work, it was basically everyone doing the minimum just to say they did something and saying they were going to do the rest of the work down the road later. This initiative, though, went on actually after he was replaced by the board of directors because the new president coming in didn't know what the project was, and it had a really good sounding name that sounded good, and he just ignored it, and the budget rolled over, and it just kept going because people had a vested interest. There was like 5 or 6 full-time people on this, and other people part-time associated with it, and it kept going and going until it finally got into the next budget cycle, and then it slowly died. But this thing went on because everyone was afraid to kill it because it was a presidential, mandate, so to speak, to do.
Yeah.
Welcome, Heather. Your comments, Hazel or Reg?
Thank you. Hi.
I'll just make a comment that sort of links what you've just said and what Gary said. This issue of perpetuating a project team because they enjoy working together and they've been enjoying some success is a very, very common thing. Psychologically, they don't want to break up, and so they create work that sounds like a good idea and sounds as if it will benefit the organization, and very often get the authority to carry on that project. And it's not until you actually stop and look at it in more detail and you realize that it actually adds little or no value, and it's certainly not worthwhile continuing. And it is just because they enjoy working together and find reasons to continue it. And this is quite common, and is yet another reason why very often when you go into an organization, one of the first things you do is break up teams.
This also then brings me to another issue of shutting things down that should have been shut down years earlier.
Yeah.
One case in point was we ran into a industry cycle, and we were basically 6 months from going out of business. So we had to do some dramatic changes before you could take the time to do other changes. And I was tasked with laying off a woman who was a great employee. I'd known her for years, but she did not work for me. And I had to lay her off because her boss was being laid off at the same time. In fact, the entire 30-person department was being closed down. And in hindsight, I can't think of a single thing that went wrong afterwards. We laid off 30 people in one department that were all doing good work. They were all doing what they were asked to do, but the organization did not miss them.
Yeah.
Now that shocked me when I thought about, that much slack being there just because we never thought about it.
Mm.
So, Ross, I've been involved, I suppose, in a variety of projects based on what has been described. To Gary's point, where they continue without really stopping, has been my experience with certainly some of the top tier consulting companies, They railroad the way because they're committed to the money. The gap in communication and their actual experience on the ground. I am yet again talking about healthcare, and and that has actually that has brought great consternation within the organizations. The other aspect as well is that incremental approach overall is necessary within healthcare because of the nature of the patient data being at the center to everything. And a big program that I was involved in, it was very successful because communication was key to everything. And where people were at one point not involved or communicated to whether they played a role or not, then became more curious, interested, was able to actually be part of it. And the buy-in then was, I suppose, organically grown from the outset. So they became champions actually of communication across the hospital as well. And at which point then that I suppose the pilot or the agile approach was implemented, it actually gave exposure to greater adoption overall. So certainly within I mean, I was involved in one of the second largest program in the world after the Indian Railways, and that was the UK Connecting for Health, which was shambles because it was purely technology driven. And to your point earlier, there were too many people involved. The wheels were going too fast that they didn't stop in time. And across the country, 16 years ago, billions then, which you can add another letter in front of billion nowadays. So, but those lessons have been learned. I'm still an absolute advocate that communication and the human aspect are fundamental to however you do it, and the timing of when they start are yet again fundamental.
Let me go back to the basic question and what I've got here is if we talk about incremental change versus the large single step change, can you get to the same place over time?
I would think, how would you ever change the underlying structures of how you're thinking in such a situation? Like, it seems like with incremental change, you're kind of working from the same basic mental structures, that you slightly adapt them, but to really have a big change, I think you have to think differently. And I don't think humans like to think differently unless they really are forced to. I guess my vote would be that it's not going to be the same.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to add the point. However, COVID-19 argues that point, Heather, because we didn't have that point. We didn't have the option to change.
Right.
We adopted, we had to take on board. We are further down the line now than, so COVID-19, has in my industry just changed everything. So sorry for interrupting there.
No, that's okay. Hazel, I agree with you very much. And that's the thing that I think I'm trying to bring up more often as we talk about this is the fact that, well, let me say from this perspective, the projects, I do a lot of change management. The projects that I've been most successful with are where there is an absolute need internally to change something. Now, they may have had their idea of what it was. We may have, through discovery, found out it might not have been quite that. It might be something else. But the point was they felt motivated without question that something had to be different. They just couldn't continue the way they were. And what you're experiencing, I mean, what we're experiencing with the pandemic is exactly that, which changes a lot about the kind of discussions you should be having anyway with people when you discuss change, because you're really not discussing change as much as you are discussing how are we going to adapt to what we need to do now. What do we not need to do that we did before that really is not improving our performance, our support to people, whatever it is we have to do. Now is our chance to get rid of the things that were based on the way we did things before, the old way, the things that people were comfortable with doing. You know,
Exactly, Arlene. Like I love that because I really think the big thing that forced change, like big forced change contributes is that you have to let go of your sacred cows. Like you can't,
yeah.
you're forced to let go, and people do not ever want to let go of things. Like, so
Uh-huh.
it's just going to be almost impossible to do that. But, you know, I mean, even on a personal level, you know, like when the chips are down and you have nothing left to lose, that's when things really shift, right? It's like, because you've already given up. If you're in a place where you've already given things up, then you can make these massive changes. But if not, then you're really forced on the outside from the outside to let go of this stuff. And that whoever wants to do that, like,
Well, you know,
Marie Kondo, it's like,
people really do and really will do that when the reason for doing that matters to them. And I'll tell you one example that I really love to use is the fact that every senior citizen, and I mean anybody over 50 and beyond, who was against technology, absolutely knows how to find their kids on Facebook, how to use Instagram, wherever their motivation is, they have learned how to deal with that. And they may have been completely against it up until the grandkids' pictures got up there. You know, then all of a sudden, show me how to do this thing. How do you use it? What do you do? And then they become active to it. And you find that happening, especially because I do a lot with, like I said, with technology, the transition from one system to another and one capability to another. People, if you tell them, I'm going to fix a problem that you've been dealing with all the time that's a pain to you, if you do it this way, they are open to it. Now, granted, it doesn't mean they'll do it willingly or even, you know, nicely, but they will do it because they can see an advantage to doing that. And it's more advantageous to do that than to keep explaining how it used to be. Okay, you know, where my cheese was. You know, here's what the cheese was, here's where it was, here's why it was so great. You know, why isn't the cheese in the same spot anymore? Well, it's gone. So let's talk about where you're going to find new cheese. We know enough about what the cheese was. So, you know, the idea really is you first, you can't allow people to wallow. Okay, that's the first thing. You cannot allow them to wallow or even to consider the idea that they might know something that would change the whole process, that would stop it from happening and leave them as they are. Because that's not a realistic expectation. So you really want them, you know, to at least figure out how to engage and not to look at them as though, oh my God, they'll just never do it. And most of the time, people only do things because that was the way they were taught. Not because it's the right way, not because it's the way they even want to do it, but it's the way that's been accepted. So yes, I'm going to keep doing what's accepted because nobody will bother me if I do that. But when you say, here's a better way, and you teach them, and they can say, this is better than that, they will gladly say, this is better than that. I will do this instead. Okay, I'm done with my long time.
If I can come in for a second. What I'm hearing almost is that it's either right or wrong. And I don't think it's that simple. If we talk about the pandemic, yes, it has caused many people in the health service to change significantly in the way they work, but it's also done the opposite in some of the key places. It's energized them to protect their own interests and put up barriers that have stopped other alternative ways of looking at situations. And so we're getting both examples, I think. We're getting very good innovation, creativity, flexibility, particularly those who are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis in difficult situations, and yet those in their empires who have sat back for years looking at surveys, reports, and made decisions on budgets and things, don't have that same urgency and are very defensive and unknowingly, I think, I don't think this is done on purpose, but unknowingly they've actually sabotaged some efforts. And so I don't think it's one or the other. I think we're always going to have a mixture of both. In terms of the difference between continual adjustment and something as dramatic as what we've all gone through or still going through in some areas more than others, is one of the opportunities you have with continual adjustment is just that. It is about identifying new ways of doing things. And I think I mentioned it in the past, this, what I call this idio management, which I take from idioculture, where in idioculture, people develop habits and behaviors that they see others do and that work for them in their environment, and they discard others that don't. And it's the same in management terms. I think with continual adjustments, we can have this idio approach, this idio management approach, with a new set of eyes. And some of these big, I mean, I've worked with central government in the UK, and one of the reasons I left is when King Blair was being anointed, I said it's time to leave. And so I've seen how they work, and I can say big change is not on their agenda. And you've got to nibble away and show that it's in their interest and so forth. So I'm in favour that we need both. So I am also a great believer of change through immersion. I think we spend too much time sometimes in many cases of change by trying to cool people down and massage their egos and things. I think give them the right environment and immerse them, and then we get on with it, which is what we've done with the epidemic. So I'm in favour of both, but I think it's about appropriateness.
Reg, I agree, and that's where I'm coming down, is that you need both. The incremental or continual adjustments won't get you to where you may need to be with some purposeful focus. But at the same time, I keep thinking that if the organization is used to change and has change competencies built in, that change is accepted as routine, then when you have to do the larger changes that are more purposeful, you're going to be able to do it a little bit quicker because they understand the change processes and what's involved.
I think also that there'll be less of these big changes, because when people talk about big changes, I often wonder what that really means. And it usually means that there's been strategic drift in the organization for some reason at some time, and they've lost track of where they're going and what they should be doing. And that is classic for me. The leadership and middle management have taken their eyes off the ball and got into their own agendas. And so I think the more we get into continual adjustment with a different form of management, much different form, we're going to have less and less of these episodic changes.
I came across something interesting the other day, which is Carolyn Meese's work. She does a lot of spiritual writing, but she was talking about the archetype, one of the survival archetypes that everybody has, and she calls this one the saboteur. But the saboteur is all about managing change, and so when you get the shadow side of it, you get either too much change or too little change. And it was interesting because she was talking about the different levels of evolution of this archetype. And one thing that really struck me, and it's just occurring to me as you're talking about this, she said the lower level version of this archetype, like kind of the less evolved version, always thinks that change has to happen in big steps and has to be external. And that as you evolve more into this archetype of being able to balance change, like the right amount of change, you start to make decisions on a smaller level. So like more daily decisions, more like moment to moment decisions about change. And also you stop thinking that it's the externals that have to change for you to experience whatever it is that you're feeling needs to shift. So just going to throw that out there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that, Heather. That usually in my world is considered the point where you kind of surrender to the fact that this level of change is probably not worth your time. That almost understanding what's in it for me, or how can I benefit from this experience, kind of gets to be the other way that people look at it. But the initial thing is always survival. Survival is always based on, is it going to mess with my livelihood, my money, what I've built as far as my career is concerned? But because that's basic survival. You know, how am I going to get past this radical difference that we're experiencing, which is what I'm pretty sure everybody's going through right now. What does my job look like now? Will I have a job? How am I going to do this now? what has changed about it so that, we can participate. At this point in time in our world, people are going to be very open to that because they want to work. And that's far more important than me working the way I used to work. So you're going to have a different kind of motivation to try to understand and deal with new things, whether you want to call it change or not. But, what's the way we do it now is going to be the way people are going to start talking. They're doing that right now when they set up for restaurants and to reopen. All of this stuff changes everything about how things are being done. The last thing we're going to have to worry about are people trying to hold on to the old. There is no old. And the motivation is, I need a job. So what do you want me to do? Very different focus than all of the other stuff we're dealing with right now.
So basically, change is less stressful now than than basic survival.
Well,
basic survival.
Well, I mean, the thing is, change is not relevant now because we've changed. I now understand what happened. So it's not whether I like to change or not. It's what's happened. What am I going to do now? Very different from you.
This depends a lot on where you are in the world. In Europe, it's very different because it's a social world. There's a significant number, and every survey has shown this over the last 2 months, that the majority who are furloughed don't want to return to work. They have got used to being home, they've got used to being with their families, and they're now rethinking what work means for them. And I think that is one change that is really ongoing at the moment. And there's no simple answer because society cannot sustain the amount of money that they're giving these people to stay at home. And yet there's a great reluctance to return. Employers are using it to reduce the numbers of people. And so there's a big gap. And so there is a
part of that. Then the other part becomes, do I need to be there to work? Do I need to be there to be productive? Does the environment that I left really support my ability to be productive in this world? And that's the decision that people are making now. It's how many people honestly need to be in an office, because we have a whole lot of other issues to deal with if we have them in an office. We have liabilities to consider. We have to make sure there's social at least in my environment. This is America, okay? So social distancing are issues. There are a whole lot of other things. And then the question really does become, is it necessary for them to be here? We interact on a regular basis through email. Okay, most of my interactions with people, if I want to talk to somebody, I literally have to get up and go see them.
But Elaine, you then get into another risk factor here, because under European legislation, if they're working from home, then all of the health and safety legislation applies to their home. So you've now got to go to your 3,000 workers, check every bit of electricity they're using, every chair they're using, and, which is extortionate price to do initially and to monitor. So there's all sorts of things. It's not, I don't think it's as simple as the distancing is probably easier actually than the alternative at the moment.
Well, see, what I think, I understand what you're saying, but what I think you're going to find is that people will look at those policies and figure out how to adjust them to make sense at this time. They don't make sense at this time. There's no way in the world that a company is going to be responsible about how an employee lives. That's a whole separate kind of issue that can't even be addressed. Nobody's coming in my house and telling me where to put my chair or whether I have a good one or not. But the point is, yes, you have your own home insurance. There may be a different way that taxing happens, that, you may be more like an entrepreneur in certain respects than you previously were because you're not housed in my environment.
This is my point. This is the whole change that's going on now, change of attitude, because it's that room is no longer your home. It's now tax deductible place of work, and so it's now under the legislation of the workplace and so forth. So it's not that easy, and that's the point I'm trying to make. But we are not gone through a change. We're still going to go through one for quite some time.
Oh yeah, we're living, but we're living through it as we go.
Yeah.
If I can
an airplane as you fly it.
If I can just take it from a different perspective, because Heather mentioned the word survival. Patience. Now, if you or I want an appointment tomorrow, we don't have a choice but to actually call, go online, make an appointment, and then do a telehealth or a video conference. So we will do what we need to do to protect ourselves. And in the conversations that have taken place, I'm picking out key things. I'm picking out technology. So first of all, survival driving some change, technology underpinning it, our behaviors as well. We're driving a lot of change. And that's not going to go away in the foreseeable future.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely. We are living through it, and whatever, I guess, whatever vision we had of how change worked before, and there were a lot of assumptions made about change management, which is one, that that first there is a better way to do it than whatever people are doing, and that what you're trying to teach them is how to adapt, how to change, what change means, how to do change, because we talk about it that way, like it's a thing. Change is a verb. Okay.
Yeah.
So people are doing it all the time. There is no management. You're literally just transitioning at all the time. You're evolving. We all evolve. So that's a natural human thing. People get committed to work or things in their workplace because they're valued for doing it that way, or because whatever that is has some value to them in terms of how they feel about themselves. So that's always that, and the fear that if they do something different, they lose all of that. That's usually the fear I'm always dealing with that. But once people get past that understanding, it goes away. It's never there again.
I'm curious if anyone has watched Marie Kondo's show, the
I don't even know
the one on
the name.
Netflix.
I think about it.
It's really interesting because she'll go into these homes and people just have, the hoarders usually, they have so much stuff, like just so much. And it's really fascinating to watch from the beginning of the episode to the end, because she comes in and she blesses the house, which is lovely. And then she starts them on their little path of explaining the process of how it's gonna work. And they're usually completely unprepared for what is coming. And she starts them off with their clothes, but she has them hold them, ask if they spark joy, right? So, which is basically a process of like, is this still relevant? Like, how is this useful? Is this relevant? Is this alive for me in my present moment, as opposed to in the past? And so she'll go through all these pieces, and it's fascinating. You probably all find it really interesting. To watch these people in that process. At first, they're like, oh, this is fun, okay. And then it starts to get real. And then they really start to like freak out. And then they really freak out. And then at some point, they kind of break down, and then they get it. Then they get that they're not letting go of stuff. They're making space for their future, right? And so, but there's always this moment that you see that shift. And I highly recommend at least watching 1 or 2 episodes just for that, because that's what we're talking about, right? It's like that point in time when you're just like, you're clutching, and then you finally just can't. You let go, and then everything shifts. And then the energy starts to move, everything goes, and then they're totally on board. They're totally into it. They're completely building their new lives. And it's because they've shifted that paradigm, really, is what it is, right? That's the moment of the paradigm shift.
The
So-
emotion.
It really is. What it really is. Hoarder shows are, well, for one thing, people hoard. There are emotional issues with hoarding. Every time they go into the backstory, it's they're dealing with some form of pain, and
well, it's scarcity and it's grief. It's holding on to the past. It's holding on to unspoken communication a lot of the time, and it's scarcity. So once they shift,
actually, it isn't really. They're not hoarding it because they think there won't be any. They're hoarding it because it has an emotional meaning to them, even if it's a bizarre thing that they've created. But this means something to me. These old papers that I've had from 1950 are really important to me because, and they have a reason, not necessarily a valid reason or even a logical reason, but they have a reason why it has meaning and why they don't want to let it go. And
and it's also obsessive compulsive disorder, which I think tells you another thing about like the mental process, right? Is like the repetitive, like holding and clutching and holding and clutching and holding and clutching. And then the let go, at that moment of letting go, I mean, the brain is shifting, right? The brain is like create a new pattern, a new neural pathway, a new sense of possibility in the world. And like they're looking at their not just their homes, but their entire lives in a completely different way. And but it's one of spaciousness, hope, and abundance. It's just
I mean, for me, hoarding is like addiction. It's a mental health issue. Most collectors also suffer with it, and so forth. It's a very, very complex subject. But what it does for me, I see that as more as getting the mental environment right for them to do whatever it is that people want them to do, and what they then themselves want to do. And I think in terms of change, it's very, very similar, as I mentioned earlier. The hygiene factors, the support structures, and so forth. And I think if we can use the current COVID situation as another example of this. So if we take where I live in Austria, life is almost normal here now. Virtually, the only difference you notice is people walk around in shops and places with masks on. And it's been managed in a very, very different way to the ways that have been reported in other parts of the world, because the environment was there from day one. We had every facility that we needed. There was never any lack of intensive care. There's never been any lack of appropriate materials. Even when we go to the supermarkets, every shop has outside it the masks that you need, the sanitizer, the person there cleaning the trolleys before you take them over. The whole environment encourages you to behave in a responsible way. There's never been any need to do otherwise. It just became normal practice. And as the changes have continued and more things are opening, restaurants are full, pubs, they've restricted hours and certain ways of people sitting in these places, but otherwise they're very, very normal, as is public transport and so forth.
I would say that you guys are actually missing an amazing opportunity by being so prepared. Because we're in the process of raising all these things to the ground, and we're going to be rebuilding them from scratch. And so it's kind of an interesting
that's an opportunity there. But in terms of change from one behavior to another, if the environment supports it, it's not a difficult process, and there's been hardly any resistance whatsoever and hardly any difficulties. And my wife's in the medical field. She's a doctor and was for many years in charge of the mental health in a city. And talking to her colleagues, they have never had a problem, never. Because
it's not a very big event for you, it sounds like. I mean, it is, but
it's been dealt with professionally. The leadership, we have had no political arguments. We have had each political party working together. The trade unions have worked with them. And so it's been a coordinated process. And it just reinforces for me that if you've got a process of collaboration and the right environment, then it's not actually such a difficult process. But when you see how others are struggling, it's
interesting
a
though, because we're going to be experiencing, our long-term care facilities are going to be completely revamped after this. I'm sure of it. Like work at home, completely different. There's restaurants are going to be looking very different in the future because so many are going to go out of business. Like there's so many industries that are going to change massively because it's so poorly managed, basically, that it's like you guys you're smoothly riding this out, but you're not going to have the dramatic shifts in innovation that we're going to see over here. So it's kind of,
can I add to that?
Sure.
Though, that America is
So you're breaking up.
Can you hear me?
No.
Hello?
That's a bit better. Yeah.
So I'm in the US from the UK just under 2 years. So that's been a massive change for me, and how I adapt it on a personal, mental and physical level it has been phenomenal, because I never thought at my age that I would. But the one thing that I do see is that America's 52 states, the equivalent of 52 countries. So for somewhere like Austria, and you've absolutely, Reg, hit the nail on the head, where you have leadership collaborating together, you get the results that you have just explained. It's here it is actually the state level. So, I'm not into politics. I never have been. I don't intend to. But in saying that, where you have such greater variance between the different states. So from Louisiana to New York to Chicago to California and everything else in between, all those states have different stats, and how they're adapting, should I say, to change is, like what you're saying, Heather, in her piece. So it's something that can be compared. And for Ireland, small country, one state as well, the change there is phenomenal. People, for sure, the residential care for the elderly and the vulnerable, it's wow, it's in chaos. But the leadership there together, and considering there are massive political challenges in Ireland at the moment, they have done the right thing. Yeah, so I guess really my point is that one can't compare the US to a smaller individual nation.
And I think, Hazel, you said a word in there, which I think is key for this discussion, which is chaos. And what Reg is talking about is not chaos, right? It's like it's like
Yeah.
order. What we're talking about
Right.
is complete chaos. It's the Wild West again, and it's from the chaos that the innovation is going to, arise out of that. Without the chaos, you're not really going to have that dramatic change and shift, right? So it's kind of interesting. I just find I'm kind of intrigued with this idea that, like, in some ways, like, our complete massive mismanagement of this crisis might actually lead to better outcomes in certain ways. Not
Oh, it absolutely will.
obviously, but long term.
It absolutely will. It will, for one thing, because the main thing that's happening now is people seeing how much of the past they will literally, that they actually can hold on to. And that counts for everywhere, because that's the issue that we're having with President Trump, is that he just wants everything to go back the way it was, period. He doesn't want to deal with any reality of it. He just wants it to be the way it was because it was working for him. And now it's not. But then you see Governor Cuomo and the rest of the governors in the United States joining together to go, hey, leadership is not involved. We need to be involved, engaged, and handle this. And you hear Governor Cuomo speaking, and it's really carrying across the country. I don't know,
it's like an alternate federal government. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, who would have thought that we would experience that? Because the actual federal government is failing so dramatically. So the governors joining together are literally creating an alternate federal government in a shadow.
And that is what you see when there's real need for something to work differently, and it's not being handled by the leadership involved. Okay, we normally see it in the sense of kind of like people hide what they're doing, and they kind of salute the top. They salute the top, but the truth is they're managing and they're creating a survival environment, and they're surviving regardless, and maintaining and protecting themselves and making sure things still work regardless.
I think what you're raising here is a very, very important thing, because I really believe that this coalition at the federal level is about self-preservation, not of the population, but of their own political positions. And I really believe that when this eases off, and in 18 months' time, things will revert back to where they were because the risk has gone. That's the nature of government.
Oh, I don't think so. See, this is the interesting thing, because in the US, it's been a long-standing discussion that the war between, like, the states versus the federal government. Whoever would have thought that there is a new alternative, a third version alternative, which is a completely separate federal government by the, created by the governors. Like, that's something that's so completely off the map. Like, no one ever would have thought about it unless it were for this situation, which really forced the issue to come to some sort of progress on it, because it's so, I mean, it's life and death. They had to figure out a solution. So this has been like the little newly birthed solution, which could actually in a few years turn into something legally. I mean, it's a stretch, but we're at the point of a constitutional crisis. Who knows what's going to happen? So it's really interesting. Like, whoever would have thought of this? right? It
No
never
one.
would have occurred to anybody.
Well, no one would have thought that we would ever be in a situation where you literally had to stay home.
Well, can you imagine? Can you
That
imagine
in
what?
itself.
Imagine what Poland felt like in 1988, 89, right? When the Berlin Wall came down, Russia collapsed. Who would have thought that as well? But it did happen here. Here I am sitting in Canada here, and it's somewhat kind of embarrassing to say that we've had to put up a wall to not allow any Americans to come into Canada. Like
I believe it. I don't think we're welcome anywhere in the world right now.
No, this is it. So, like, I mean, you Americans just stay home, thank you very much. And then you've got a federal government that's kind of, supporting that nationalistic view. So all this is coming down here. Now, I'm kind of like, well, in Canada, we're kind of like in Reg. We're trying to stay normal, but what the pandemic has revealed is that we got some bad situations here over in Ontario, and I'm in British Columbia, where we try to stay together. But in Ontario, they've exposed how poorly the elderly people have been taken care of. We've thrown them into the homes and just kind of forgotten about them. Military has had to go in there and expose what's happening here. So now there's chat about maybe from a national point of view, we have to look after the elderly because the private and the public levels are not doing a good job. So I think what we've got in Canada anyways, it sounds like we do actually have some sort of a leader. But the neat thing about in Canada, that the leaders, the politicians, aren't speaking every day as much as the local health scientific person in charge. They're the ones who are saying, we open, we lock down here, and the politicians are there, but they're in the background and they just nod their heads. So we're trying to be somewhat scientific based, and so far it's kind of working, but we're always concerned about the one or two cracks, that could break that. And I really see what you're saying, Heather, because I really see that in the Pacific Northwest, how the governors have pulled together here. And in the past, we've always called this Caledonia, because in British Columbia, we probably have more connections north-south than east-west, right? So Washington, Oregon, even down to California and British Columbia. Here we're talking about, like, should we get rid of daylight saving time? We're kind of going like, well, let's see what Oregon and Washington are going to do, whether we should change or not. We're waiting for you guys to make some decision, but of course, that is so low on the agenda right now. Don't even think about it. So we're staying with what we got. And we really don't care what the other provinces do because we're more aligned with you guys.
Well, that's an interesting thing. The shift, a lot of people are talking about a shift towards more regional governments, as opposed to like, we have these massive countries, but like, and all across where, if you look at where the economies are actually happening, like in my area in New England, Western Massachusetts is more aligned with Connecticut because of the river, the Connecticut River, and then like Boston is its own kind of thing, so it's like the lines on the map don't necessarily represent true areas and regions. And in Africa, it's such a severe problem, but they actually did that intentionally to create a little chaos, which is a whole other thing. But just as an aside, I guess that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. But that process of like, how it's such a massive project, right? To rewrite a map like that, like say you did like, kind of break things up into where like regional economies are actually functioning, and then the maps reflected that, like the political maps reflected that, and the boundaries and all that stuff. It'd be interesting, but it's a huge thing. Like, when would you ever be able to pull that off, except for some dramatic thing like this, right? Like, or something even bigger. So it's like these massive events. I feel like these massive events are the things that have to happen for such dramatic change to happen.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no way that it would ever happen. Otherwise,
I think you've got a good opportunity there. But Gary mentioned Germany. Yeah, the wall came down, but you still have East and West Germany in every political sense and behaviour of the population and politics. Nothing's changed. And so just bringing down walls and the symbols and fine words, they're not going to do much, because once that had happened, we went back to normal politics in Europe, and the issues of the East and the difficulties they had, the people there would go back to become East Germany tomorrow. because nothing's changed for them. And so this is my concern with the US, with this federal thing. It's great. It's an opportunity. They tried it in India. That's a federation of states, and they tried to change it in the way that America is moving a little bit. That failed because it created another entity, another risky political entity, whereas the states themselves, they feel safer and more secure. But once they start aligning with other states, then they start to talk about aligned taxation and other political issues, like we've got the problem in the EU at the moment. And so the populations say, no, we're not paying the same state tax as this state. That's more. We don't pay tax in this area. And all those arguments. So the politicians feel insecure, so they drop the ball and carry on as normal. And that's my fear, is what you'll have.
So I think that one of the biggest bubbles that's rising, well, there are many bubbles, but certainly one that has now, if not at the top, is the conversation on risk management. So as opposed to the old change methodologies, now people are focusing more about the risk element. And that is certainly, you know, even Gartner and all McKinsey and all those up the world, that seems to be the paradigm shift to where we are now. And for me, sorry, I keep using the word healthcare, but one of the biggest bubbles that has actually burst out of this massive change with COVID-19 now is the focus on cybersecurity and how are people having to adapt to that. So, you know, there's a pandemic and now there's an epidemic on the cybersecurity aspect. And this is a new, well, it's not a new topic. It's a topic now that is getting significantly more attention and reaction because now healthcare is actually the top critical infrastructure industry that is being targeted, and this is a whole new beast that not just hospitals are having to firefight from a health point of view, but also as well the resources and the challenges of working from home and the PPE, and you know, this is constant, and there is massive I suppose, concern because of the lack of resources in this area as well. How is this actually going to be addressed to defend, protect, moving forward?
Well, I'd like to say just a couple of things about that. One, cybersecurity has been a big issue for more than 10 years in terms of really being focused on. There are huge amounts of people in that industry, government-wise, commercially, everywhere, dealing
There
with
are, Arlene. I'm
people
sorry, but I have to contradict you there, and apologies. It has not gotten the attention. I have done masses of amount of work in due diligence. It is a topic that is there. It has not got the recognition and attention that
let me speak about maybe not in the health industry until now, because there hasn't been the level of concern. Once, you know, for one thing, you know, there's kind of an unspoken thing. People don't really mess around with your medical records. So, you know, you don't usually see people trying to steal other people's medical records necessarily. I mean, it's not a high level thing. But now, because cures to this virus are being studied, because treatment for the virus is being studied, and because there's going to be huge money in whoever figures out the right answers to any of those things or any answers, it is an absolute hotbox. They are stealing. They are trying to interact with each other internationally. You've got people trying to figure out what everybody else is doing. So yeah, they're trying to break into every system possible medically now to understand how to take advantage of this situation in that respect. But I work with the government. So, and you know, the issues with voting and all of the issues that have been going on, and what's his name that went to Russia and gave out secrets from the NSA. Believe me, there is a whole lot of work being done in cyber stuff. But from a medical perspective,
well, you can steal people's identities with all the information that they have on their healthcare forms. So that's probably that's probably a lot of it.
Yeah, they make them
Anyway.
fill out too many forms, honestly.
They
The same
steal
information.
housing rental applications as well, because for that reason you've got all the pertinent info on there. But
I think there's linking into the cybercrime and things. When we look at change, very often there are fringe benefits and there are also fringe risks that are identified. And there's been a trend now in the banking world to go cashless, and that's tremendous emphasis on that in Europe. And what the pandemic has shown us is the risk of going cashless.
Mhm.
Because once the IT is not working, nothing works, because you have
Yeah.
no funds, you have no access to buy, and so forth. And yet, the arguments from governments is because of the dirty money and the germs on money, it reinforces the need to go paperless. And so they're putting even more effort into a risk that is higher and known to be higher than it was before. And this is how governments are. And this is why
that's such a wonderful paranoia, because like I don't know, like the risk of like getting something for money is, I don't know. It's just funny to me. I'm so struck by like there's like the issue and then there's the reaction, and like so often the reactions like, well then therefore we need to do blah 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 blah. It's like these reactions are so outsized, like with
absolutely
9/11. I mean, when 3,000 people die, and then we subsequently like created a 10-year war that killed, like, that massively destabilized the entire world. Like,
Mhm.
like, but we have to do something. It's like, do we?
It's true.
Do we really?
They did some extremely crazy things too through the whole part of 9/11 and everything. I mean, I went into Baltimore Airport and right after 9/11, they took out every knife in the entire airport, in the kitchens, everywhere, so you couldn't cut anything. Why they thought this made sense, I have no idea. American Airlines prevented people from bringing their own sweetener on the plane because it looked like whatever that stuff was. I can't remember that thing that was going around. And I said, oh yeah, so you want people to bring their own, it's like, we're not going to give you any sweetener. You have to have your own. I said, yeah, you want people to bring white powder on the plane because that's safer in your mind. I mean, you sit there and you're asking people questions like, why are you taking my eyebrow pencil sharpener, which is an inch long? It's this big.
But you see what I mean?
Be
Like,
able to screw the blade out and do damage.
If
Help
you
me.
got fear-driven policies, you're always going to get absurd stuff like this, right? It's just the people are freaking out. And like from a lot of the stuff that I'm researching right now, it's like literally when people are stressed out, they literally make bad decisions, like quantifiable bad decisions. Like it is
Of course.
officially like exactly wrong. Like they're going to choose the wrong path. Like no doubt about it. Like, right? So it's like,
Yeah, but Heather, the brain is designed for that. The brain's designed. As soon as you get the adrenaline going, it shuts down all the amygdala, shuts down everything because it's fight or
like
flight.
the best way to eliminate options, right? Is to like put some stressed out people in a room and give them a problem and figure out everything that they choose, and then just say, okay, these are all the things we're not going to do. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah. And most of it is because it's logical, because I'm panicking. Okay. And I've got one other person who agrees with me. So we're going to march this way because we both at least agree. No one else is making any decisions, but we two have figured out something and we're going to take action. And
so it seems to me from Ross's question, this episodic approach to change has more risks than continual change. Because the fear notion in episodic is going to be greater.
Risk is fear of loss, right? Like you're afraid of risk, you're afraid of loss, you're afraid of change. And so you, by definition, like the more you're trying to manage your risk, the less you're going to change. And like the less, but we've established earlier that the key to like change and innovation is being able to let go of stuff. So if you're so paranoid, and I see this in the US, I keep having this question, I'm like, yes, people are dying, but like, why are we so afraid of death? Like, I mean, it begs the question, right? It's like, as a society, why is death bad? Like we think death is bad in America, and it's like, well,
Well,
it's part of it. It's like,
Is it death or the process of death that they fear?
well, it's the trauma around it, it's the fear, it's the paranoia, it's like not being able to control it. It's like, all these
Well,
things.
that's the fear right there is
To me, it's like
control.
millions of children going hungry is so much worse than people dying. But that's me, so we all have different.
The main thing, though, is people are afraid because they feel they don't have control. And, that's the big thing. And then there are some people who must maintain control. So they're the ones who freak out. And then there are other people who go with the flow. They're like, okay, well, it's different now. What do we do now? And you have the different attitudes, but a lot of it is around how I can maintain my personal safety. Whatever that means to me. But my personal safety is the thing that's going to make me make a decision or be against an idea because I'm concerned about what might happen.
Right. And it always comes back down to like me in a physical body. Like, how am I going to take care of my physical body? Like, how am I physically going to like navigate through the day so that I am still alive and healthy by the end of the day? Right. It always comes back to this. We're humans. We have like such complicated thought processes, but at the end of the day, like that's literally what it is. Like, am I safe? Am I like, is my body intact? like
you are never not going to be motivated by your own survival. You just never will not be motivated by your own survival, period.
I would say to my students, there are three things that drive all our decisions: fear, food, and sex. Fear is about survival.
Absolutely right.
Food is about nourishment to survive. And sex is to keep the race going. And they're the three things. Outside of that, nothing else matters.
No, they're all related to total survival. They're related to survival.
Let's talk about the fear and control a little bit relative to continuous, incremental versus transformative. It's those big changes that really is difficult to give people control over because they're largely centrally managed, versus if you have a number of changes across the organization, such as a Kaizen model, that gives people more control over change. Does that have an impact?
Well, so
fear, right?
I guess that segues nicely into kind of what I was thinking earlier when we're talking about is an agile approach more risky. So there's a huge program going on within the government at the moment on ensuring that interoperability, i.e. Movement of data about a patient is transparent to enhance their care. And certainly with COVID-19 now, to not do it in an agile approach would be sacrosanct. It has to be tested out on a smaller environment rather than do a big bang approach. So I guess.
Can you explain what that means? When you say agile and big bang, can you just sort of describe the differences in the processes? Just help me.
So it's easier to go, if not state by state or actually city to city, testing this out first, rather than actually setting it, putting in technology that will enable it across the country.
Yeah, which is what we did with the healthcare and our health cards.
Well,
yeah, it was done city by city.
Yeah, and now a bigger solution has come into the UK, which I worked on, which does actually enable a national approach and has been hugely beneficial. So I guess really my question at the beginning was the approach and control would depend on the size of the change that is going to be done.
Yeah. I mean, if I could just pick up the healthcare one, in Austria, what we did, everybody was given a health card, an e-card, which has a chip in it. And initially, it just showed that you had paid into the system. And when you went to the GP or the hospital, it was used to identify that you were a legitimate user of the free services. And then the next stage was locally to put your medical records on, because in Austria, we all keep our own records. The doctor doesn't keep them historically. I've got a drawer at home with every x-ray and everything that's ever been done to me in Austria. you have your own and you take them with you. But they're now on your e-card, but it can only be seen locally in the district you're in. The next stage will be it can be seen nationally. And the people, the population, have been totally supportive of this. It's the medical profession that's been against it, because they believe they will be liable because they didn't go 20 years back in your history when they're making the diagnosis, and therefore you can sue them. So we had the opposite problem to what they had in the UK. But it was done incrementally, and it's been very smooth, and it works extremely well.
But what you're talking about is a large change being implemented incrementally, which is what all, and this is my issue, is what do you mean by large change anyway? Because all changes, especially if they affect a large group of people, then you are probably going to do them incrementally for several reasons. One is because you have to figure out whether the solution you want to do actually works. Then you have to understand if there's any differences in how it works. If this group of people does it, will it be different than what this group of people does? This is the strategy that you create that allows you to create whatever communications you're going to have, that helps you understand who you're affecting as far as stakeholders are concerned, and what exactly will they need to do this well.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why I was trying to understand the difference when Hazel was talking about Big Bang and Agile. It just sounded like incremental change, and that's what I was trying to make sense of. Whereas the continuous change is very different.
They're all
talking about
change.
You're talking about implementation, and that, I think, to me the big change is the change in thinking of how to do something, right? It's like that's the change of the ideas, to me, is more where
that's part of implementation.
Implementation is just kind of like filling in the dots afterwards.
No, you're implementing using people. Actually, to get something to work, regardless of installing software or hardware or anything else, in order for it to be a functional thing, people have to use it. People have to use it well for it to have value. So you are implementing with people every time you implement. And that separation, all this idea that things are separate from each other, is amazing to me. It's all one thing. Okay, you're doing a big change, you're doing a little change. You want a good strategy that's going to achieve the result you're going after. It may mean that you bring only a certain group of people together first and then spread them out so you share it. It may mean that you have to go and sit down with individual teams each and find out exactly what's going on with them and how they can be a part of the change or involved, excited, whatever. But it's all the same kind of thing. It's what problem are we trying to solve, or what are we trying to make different? And what's the best way to do that? Who needs to be involved? What are we asking them to do? How long do you think it might take? What kind of feedback are we going to get from them if we ask that? Is this going to be a negative thing that they think won't work, or will they think it will work? What would help them adjust better? These are the kind of discussions you should be having with an effective change strategy. And I don't care what size of change you're trying to deal with. These are the same issues. People are.
Arlene, I think Heather was trying to separate the concept from implementation, the ideas of the different things that could happen at the end, rather than how to do it, so that
all of those,
you get innovation.
Implementation is never a final thing. Implementation is never final.
The implementation does change the concept, right? It alters the concept.
Absolutely.
So that's fair. That's fair.
Well, yes, it does, but it also doesn't ever stop. Okay, you're continuously adjusting and using things differently and continuing. Your initial idea was great until you figured out how it really worked, and then you change and do something else. But
so when we talk about a paradigm shift, I mean, we're talking about the difference between, like, to me, continual change, like incremental change, is like, and I especially, like, the town that I live in, it's this really historic town, and it's hilarious when you look at these houses, these really, like, these old colonial houses, not old by European standards, but people adapt them over time, and they change them and they restructure them, and they, like, block off certain rooms. They'll create an apartment in this, but they're always shifting and changing on a continual way, but it's something to get to the paradigm shift level. To me, that's like knocking the whole house down and starting fresh. It's like, and it makes more sense when you do that, right? But you do also lose some of the variety that you get of the quirkiness and the, like, weird little corridors and things that you get in these houses that have been changed little bit by little bit over time, when it's not this, and completely thought out restructuring. So I don't know. I really feel like with incremental change, you're never really, without taking down like the solid like infrastructure, the core structure of something, you're not ever really going to get to a full paradigm shift. Like, I don't see how it's possible unless you completely raise everything to the ground. Like, you're just still working with the same paradigm, I think.
Okay, we're down to 15 minutes now. Let me shift a little bit to change fatigue. There's been an issue of change fatigue on a number of discussion boards recently. And is it possible even to limit change fatigue when change is coming from all directions? And is it better to have a lot of small changes versus one big change to reduce change fatigue? Because I've seen it argued both ways.
What do you mean exactly by change fatigue?
Basically, people gaining more and more resistance to any change whatsoever because they're just tired of basically being told what to do, and they just want some stability in their life again.
Okay. First, in the environment we're in now, those are gone. Okay. There is no one that can literally hold on to what they used to do. Even people, no matter what industry right now in America, anyway, there is no hold on to what we used to do. We're literally trying to figure out how to keep doing or how to do now. So
There are plenty of people who get left by the wayside because they can't adapt. Like,
well, and that will happen. That will happen because, like you see, businesses are closing. Hertz just went bankrupt yesterday. Rental cars. Who thought rental cars would ever go bankrupt? Come on. So,
But if you,
there's a lot of change happening, and there's a lot of things that are going to affect people that have never been thought of before. But the assumption that somehow there is some form of stability here that you can point people back to,
Yeah. Okay.
is not realistic.
Yeah, I agree totally, but that still faces the issue then on, and do we build an organization with change competency and give people more control over change, or do we find a better way to do change with the realization that stability is no longer possible and we're going to have to learn to handle change fatigue because we can't tolerate it?
I think people have to
So-
learn on an individual level how to deal with change because like it is so individual. I mean, like to me, like I see people like faced with change and like they're right back in their adolescence because that's like a period of time when there was a lot of change and it was overwhelming, you know, like well, how do people respond on a personal, physical, physiological, and psychological level to change? Like some people is just like overwhelmed. The mere mention of it is overwhelmed. They go into panic and paralysis. Whereas if you like learned how to work through your own triggers around that, you're going to be a little bit adaptable.
I would
right?
have to say, honestly speaking, people,
organizationally, that is where education and awareness is fundamental to support people and to ensure that they are knowledgeable.
oh, absolutely. But no one is ever in the position where they have enough time to honestly feel scared to the point of immobility about
I think
changing.
people do. I mean, that's
Yeah,
I'm one of those people.
I disagree. I disagree.
No, I mean, no, but let me finish because I've seen and dealt with a whole lot of these people going through all of this kind of change for many, many reasons. And yes, there are always going to be people who will never change, and they usually leave because they cannot sustain what they used to do in the new environment. Okay, so they cannot keep their security the way they had it. So yeah, they usually have to leave. Then you have other people who are scared. You know, they're going to adapt more slowly. They need a lot more reassurance, but they will adjust, especially if they see a benefit to adjusting. You know, if I can do something I used to do better, then I will. But you do have to support them. Without question, you have to educate everyone. Without question, there has to be a high level of communication and some form of feedback. This works well. This does not work. We can't keep doing this. It's not working. You know, so there has to be that kind of, we're going to react and keep building and keep evolving on this. But change, the word change, teaching people change, none of this stuff is relevant to getting people to do things. What's relevant is either you focus them on fixing a problem that they feel like they can add value to, and you thank them for it, and you highly, you know, recognize their achievement, involvement, or they literally just have to suck up and deal with it.
I think a lot
lot
of
of
creating a
my
sense of
work
safety
is
too. Like you create a sense of safety, and you can do that with ritual and like, you know, really not just focusing on change so much, but is like focusing on like just the safety piece, right? Because that's the counterbalance, that's the counterpoint to change. Like change is scary, you know, like how do we make people feel more adaptable to change just to make them feel safe at the same time as changing, you know, like bake some chocolate chip cookies at the same time. You like have like I've been playing like all this music from like high school just because it's comforting, you know, it's like, okay, at least that's consistent. I walk around town and I see a library that was built before the Revolutionary War. And I'm like, oh, okay, even if our government completely collapses, at least this library will still be here. You know, it's like the sense of continuity, the sense of safety, it counteracts. So you can change in the ways that you want to change if you provide that cushion and that increased support and safety for people to bring down that stress level on a physiological level, right? So it's like by playing both of those, so instead of like clinging to the past that doesn't work for them out of panic, they can let go of that piece. They can cling to their little pot roast and chocolate chip cookies and like
I see change
but as
fatigue.
part
I see change fatigue very differently here. I see the fatigue is not about having to change. It's more about the lack of continuity in management's decision making. And they get fed up with every 3 months when they get a new manager or a new fad is read in a magazine and everything's got to change again. And it's changed for the sake of change. And over time, you just get fed up with that because you just want to continue doing your job. And if it's a new tool that makes it easier, great. But just change for the sake of it builds up. And I'm working with an organization at this very time which is really into change fatigue. They've had 5 CEOs in the last 6 years. Nearly every middle manager has changed at least 3 times in that period, and every one of them has wanted to do things differently. And this
Reg,
is
would you
what
say
they're fed up
it's
with.
a crisis of purpose? Because that sounds to me like when things are changing constantly, it's like, what's the purpose? You know, like people have to have their own consistent sense of purpose,
Yeah,
right?
I don't
may
think it's
I
about
ask a
purpose. I
question?
think it's about how they meet that purpose. Yeah.
So
It is exactly
this
that.
is
I,
why this
I'm
is why
sorry.
change in our operational readiness is essential before driving a new approach, because that's how you can actually assess the feelings of people, their emotions, collect them, get the buy-in, get the leadership on board, and start really establishing that collaborative approach to decide actually if moving forward is going to be feasible.
I agree, because my first question when I went into this organization, and the boss was quite clear, he said they're suffering from change fatigue. So I said, well, why are you asking to change again? And he just looked at me and I said, yeah, point taken. And so we had a long conversation about that and got the workers together. And this is why this really came out from all of them. They don't mind change if there is a reason for it and it makes sense. But this continual change for unnecessary and just change of management, this is what builds up the fatigue, and it has enough. And so we had to address that first.
Okay, Reg, let me pick up on that then. If it's from like a change in management, which often happens in reorganizations,
Yeah.
what happens if we go to a more informal organization structure where the clear positional authority is not in place? Are we subject then to possibly more change initiating across the organization without clear alignment that would cause the fatigue from your perspective?
No, because if you go into collaborative teams, then you're working collectively and you don't change for the sake of change. You're changing to achieve something collaboratively. That may be a change in the way the customers react and work. It may be sourcing new materials and so forth. And that's day to day. This is where this continual change comes in. And I think day to day change of that type is necessary and is manageable in quotes by collaboration and so forth. The episodic change, the sort of the bigger ones or the new broom who comes in, then they're the ones I think that create the more difficulties for the workforce. But we know that if you get the environment right, the hygiene factors, you don't even think about a computer system coming in until everyone's got the equipment so they can practice on it before the system goes live and all this sort of stuff, then it's not such an issue. It's how you implement it and the environment you provide. So that then reduces any opportunity for people to get fed up with change.
So
Can I mention
let-
one thing there? One of the things that I've noticed when you talk about change fatigue like that, and that's what you're saying, Reg, is people are tired of being involved in a change process that failed. It literally didn't change anything. They were engaged. They started to try to do something differently. And then generally speaking, leadership just gave up on it, or it was overcome by other events, but something happened and it never got completely changed. So they
Or
never
maybe
saw
it's failure fatigue.
well,
I think it's a
you call it
combination.
failure.
I think
I
it's a
know when I come
combination.
into environments, that's what I hear first.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of.
We did that. It didn't work. I'm sick of it. I'm not doing it. Is
Yeah.
what you hear.
I think it's a combination of things. It's what you say is most changes never get finished. The energy gets lost somewhere, or someone leaves who was driving it. So that's one element that can cause fatigue. The other is it's actually working okay, but the person who comes in says, "Well, I don't like Windows. We're going over to, I don't know, Linux, and so we're going to change all the systems and everything like that." And the next one comes along and says, "Who on earth introduced Linux? I'm a Windows person." And it's this continual personal preferences that creates unnecessary change that they get fed up with. And I see this is the predominant one in the organizations I've worked with.
That
Yeah.
is
Doesn't it come
definitely
from,
the
like,
way it
Wants
works.
to leave
The
them.
military organizations I work in, that's exactly how it works, because leadership is like on a 2-year time frame.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
they have to come in
Yeah.
and they have to make a major splash in their 2-year time frame.
Yeah, it's like ego-driven
So
leadership,
you find,
right?
hold on one second, Heather. What you find with these people is you have a whole level of, they protect themselves from the leadership. Okay, they continue work as it always was, but they give some superficial feeling of comfort to leadership so they can keep working.
Well, this comes into an issue of like the ego-based leadership versus what, more servant-based leadership, right? Where leadership is genuinely listening to everyone down the food chain and like responding accordingly. And like, so people feel heard, they feel, because even, in times where they're trying to do some big dramatic thing, like put in a new power plant or something, and they need to get local support. And then people are totally against it, not in my backyard. What they'll do is they'll go and they'll have like a little, session where everyone can speak their feelings and talk about it and blah, 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 and they get it out of their system. And it's supposedly to get their feedback, but it's actually just to let them vent, because after they vent, they're okay. Like they go and they'll let you go on with the power plant and they don't mind as much. It's about being listened to. So it's like people having this issue of not being seen, being like just bandied about like a badminton birdie, and like leadership is not listening whatsoever, right? Because it's all about their personal ego and preferences. But don't you think like shifting to a model that's more based on like continual feedback between, from the bottom to the top, as well as from the top to the bottom, like that would eliminate so much of this?
No, I don't think it would. And the reason I say that is because it would be going through a process that has no meaning. Whereas most leadership in key positions have historically been tall males, narcissistic. They are not going to make the same impression in going through any process, because people know that it has no meaning. So it's got to have real meaning. It's not just a process. It's a
Oh no,
combination.
I'm saying a process with the meaning, and like different models of leadership. I mean, that's a very European style, kind of the top down thing. But in different societies, like in different cultures, like it's not necessarily like that. It's much more community oriented, much more group based, group decision making. Certainly in female culture, that's the case. And this is going to be changing all these companies. This is the change that's coming, is like this change in like leadership styles. You see that with Bernie. Everyone loved him, and it's because he was like a man of the people. It's like, and it's appealing to other cultural norms of more leadership that is more based on listening to the people, being led by the people.
However, Heather, to Reg's point, I can confidently say in healthcare, the same leadership style applies internationally. it is changing. You're absolutely right now because of diversity and more women. They have to change too. But oh my goodness, I have been in hospital boardrooms where females have been leaders and narcissism doesn't describe them.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a survival mechanism for women who have had to build their way up through.
No. That's an excuse. I'm
This
sorry.
stage.
That's an excuse.
But let me just say one thing about what you were saying, Heather. What I noticed, especially in military organizations, any leadership that respected the people, that literally sat down and said, I'm new here. How do you do things? Help, update me on what goes on. Those people had better relationships than the people who came in with the narcissistic approach, totally in charge. You're going to do what I say. I'm gonna fix all the problems you have because that's going to affect my ability to get to my next job. And those are the people. That's where cognitive dissonance is wonderful.
But don't you think, like, over time that these leaders are better? They're going to create their organizations. Are going to be better organizations. Over time, these organizations are going to beat out the organizations that are working with bad leadership, right? Like, so you see over time, like, it's going to shift.
Honestly speaking, they're just going to continue to survive under that. Now, they will benefit from leaders that respect them and talk to them and interact directly with them. And they will not benefit as much from leaders who don't, but they will have both, and it will continue forever.
Oh, I don't agree.
Okay, we are nearing the end. Any last minute comments in the last 2 minutes we have? Reg, any comments you'd like to wrap up?
Yeah, I just like to say that we've raised some really important issues here, and as you and I have discussed, Ross, next month we're going to change tack in the way we approach things, and we're going to have 4 very different subjects, but all related. And some of the issues that you've been talking about today will come up. And particularly one point that's come out on the network over the last few days and was touched on here. And this is the relationship of change with project management, change management consultancy, and this whole idea of how they all work together and so forth. And so I hope you can all join us next week when we kick off in this new way. And I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you for everyone for joining us today. Arlene, Gary, and Reg, if you could hang on for a few minutes after others leave, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.